Hello and welcome to English 203, Introduction to Literary Study. I'll be your instructor, Dr. Sam Lackey, and this is the Week 1 lecture. So let's go ahead and get started. In the first half of this lecture, I would like to just provide a general overview of the class, what to expect, what we're going to be doing in here, how the class is set up, basic first day stuff. And then in the second half, I would like to jump into chapter 1 of our textbook. So this is the only required book for the class. Hopefully you already have it, or at the very least it is on the way. It's of course basically got the same name as the class, an Introduction to Literary Studies. Make sure you get the third edition. There are multiple editions of this book, and we are using the third. That's the most recent. The author is Mario Clarer. It's a small book. It's relatively affordable. Obviously, you can purchase it through the GBC bookstore. You can also get it in an ebook form. You can find used copies. It's widely available online, so you should not have any problem locating the book. And hopefully you have it now, or you will have it soon, because we are reading chapter 1 here in week 1. So it's a short chapter. It will not take you long to get through it, but you obviously need the book. So if you're having issues with the book, if you don't have it yet and you're afraid that you might not have it for some time, email me. Let me know and let's work something out. I can make the first chapter available in PDF form. And if enough people need me to do that, I'm happy to do that here in week 1. I'm happy to post it to Web Campus. But you really need to have the book by the beginning of week 2 because we're moving right along with our readings. So let me know if you have any issues related to the book. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about this class. What is it all about? What is literary study? So I think the good news here is that most of us are at least somewhat familiar with what I mean, what most people mean when we say the term literary study. Most of you have some experience doing this kind of work. I mean, even if we don't like English class, even if we don't like to read or to read literature, we've all done it before, usually in an academic context. So think back to previous English classes. You can think about 101. You can think about high school. You can go all the way back to middle school. We've all read literature in a class, and then oftentimes we are forced to then write about the literature that we read. So we've already gotten some experience analyzing literature. We've learned some basic things about elements of literature. We've certainly read literature and written about it in various ways over the course of our educational careers. So we're not starting from scratch here. We're not starting from square one. But even though we've done the kind of work that we're doing in this class, we've done it before, but there's often a sort of mystery that surrounds the study of literature. Even though we've done it before, we're often, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in my experience, many students are uncertain or unsure of themselves when it comes to analyzing works of literature. You've learned certain things. You've learned how to do this kind of work to a certain extent, but there still remains this mystery, this vague quality. We're not quite sure what literature is. We're maybe not always quite sure how to analyze it. We're pretty good at offering plot summaries, but maybe offering original interpretations might pose a little bit more of a challenge. So one of our goals in this class is to demystify this whole process, this whole area of study. I want us to really understand what literary study means, what it is, and most importantly, how to do it. It doesn't mean we're all going to love it. It doesn't mean we're all going to do it all the time for the rest of our lives. But we can master some new skills in this class, and we can also build upon some existing skills. So perhaps that makes us feel a little more confident. Maybe we already felt confident, but hopefully that makes sense. And what I want you guys to start doing, think about the study of literature as an academic discipline, as a field of study. Just like we can study biology or history or economics, we can also study literature in an academic context. So just like the study of biology or economics, those fields of study, they have rules, right? They have certain techniques, certain procedures. They have vocabulary of their own. They have certain words and terms that are unique to them. Well, the same is true when it comes to the study of literature. The study of literature has its own vocabulary. It has its own set of techniques, its own set of methods, strategies, and we're going to be learning a lot of those over the course of this semester. And of course, the end goal with the study of literature is kind of similar to the end goal with the study of almost anything. We're trying to find solutions. We're trying to find answers. We're trying to arrive at original interpretations that help to provide some of those answers, some of those conclusions. Now, of course, literature is very subjective. We know that. English is different from math or science or even social sciences for that very reason. English is more subjective. The way we often express this is that in math class or in science class, there's usually just one correct answer, and it's your job to find that answer. Whereas in English, there can be lots of right answers. It's not quite as cut and dry. And that's true, and that's where part of the mystery and the confusion comes in. Because literature is not as cut and dry as science or math, or in some cases even history, where there often is like a verifiable answer that we can find, and it's often pretty cut and dry, although history can get messy as well. So yeah, I understand that, but once we get comfortable with the techniques and the strategies and the vocabulary that goes along with literary study, if we think about literary study as an academic discipline, a field, all its own, then we can get comfortable with it. We're not going to necessarily like every aspect of it, but we're going to come to a greater understanding of it, and we'll be able to use some of these strategies, some of these vocabulary terms. We'll be able to use these methods to do our own literary study. And those are some of our big goals for the semester. So we'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by all of that once we get into chapter 1. But for now, let's just talk a little bit about Web Campus and the course syllabus. So if you guys are watching this lecture, you've probably already discovered our weekly modules in Web Campus. But just take a moment, if you haven't already, to check out all of the other material in the Week 1 module. So this is obviously an online class. So the way I provide information for you guys is at the beginning of each week, on the Monday morning of each week, I will post that week's module. I will publish that week's module, and everything that you need for the week can be found in that module. So each week I'll have a lecture just like this one that you can watch or at least listen to. The choice is yours. I'll also have any assignments that might be due that week. I will have links to those assignments. So you can already see our first discussion post is due at the end of this week. It's a very easy assignment, so check that out. We're just introducing ourselves in the first discussion. But we also have our first alternative media assignment due at the end of this week. So alternative medias are designed to be fun. I think we have 4 or 5 of them throughout the semester, and if you read the instructions for the first one, you'll get a feel for what kinds of work we're going to be doing with the alternative medias. Basically, I'm giving you guys a chance to write about stuff that you might be a little bit more familiar with. Obviously, throughout the semester, we're going to be writing about literature. We know that much here at this early stage. We're going to be writing about plays and poems and short stories and other types of literature. You guys know that. But with the alternative media assignments, you'll have an opportunity to write about other types of media, as the name suggests, other types of art forms. And as we're going to learn beginning today with chapter 1, different kinds of texts are classified differently, and we're going to learn about traditional definitions of literature, and we're going to realize that a lot of the stuff that we like, movies, TV shows, stuff on the internet, graphic novels, we're going to see that a lot of those texts, a lot of those art forms are not included in the traditional definitions of literature. Now, we might object to that, and the author of our book kind of suggests that maybe we should expand the definition of literature in some ways. But with the alternative media assignments, you get to write about movies or shows or graphic novels or maybe music in some cases, or web pages, other types of media, other types of art. But you're going to try to apply some of the things that we learn about literature to these other alternative texts. So that should be fun, and it gives us a chance to work with stuff that we like, to work with stuff that we know. I'm sure some of us like literature and some of us like to read it for pleasure, but the alternative media will give you a chance to really go to some stuff that's in your wheelhouse, stuff that you really enjoy. And again, you enjoy it outside of school. You enjoy it separate from that academic context, which is kind of the whole idea. So they're fun, they're short, they're worth 50 points apiece, and the first one is due at the end of this week. So please read the instructions. When you click on the assignment link inside the module, you'll go to a new page where you will read my instructions, you can read my prompt, and take a minute to read everything first before you get to work. And let me know if you have any questions. So yeah, the modules are going to be the way that basically the classes run. I'm going to post everything to our modules, everything that you need, all of the assignments, all of the lectures. That's where our discussions will take place, and we are doing discussion posts every week, with a few exceptions. There will be a few weeks where I give you a break because you have something else due, some bigger assignment due that week. But typically, you'll just get into the habit of doing a discussion every week, and then some weeks you might have an alternative media due as well. So you'll have to juggle both of those. But if we have a larger assignment, like a critical response, or obviously our big paper at the end, I'll usually cut the discussion posts on those weeks. So take a look at the syllabus. It is also available in the week 1 module. I just provided a link to the document. You don't have to read it word for word, but I really want you to check out the course schedule. So that begins on page 6 of the syllabus. And that's a detailed and complete course schedule. So you can see what we're doing each week of the semester. I provide all of the info and most importantly, all of the due dates. So all of our reading assignments are there, and all of the due dates for written assignments can also be found there. I don't list the discussion posts because, again, we're just doing those every week. It seems repetitive to put those in the syllabus, but all the other assignments are listed, all the due dates are there. So if you want to kind of work ahead, if you want to look ahead to see when everything's due, feel free. That schedule is available, again, beginning on page 6 of the syllabus. So take a look at that. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm guessing that by now we're all pretty comfortable with Web Campus, but if you have any questions, if you're having difficulty finding stuff or navigating, just let me know. And the final thing I'll say before we jump into chapter 1 is just to kind of think about a week for us. In this class, a typical week will begin on Monday morning when I publish that week's module. So unless you're a super early riser, most of the time when you get up on Monday morning, that week's module will be available. It will be published. I don't expect you guys to check it every Monday, first thing in the morning, although that would be great. But just take a look at some point early in the week. If not Monday, then Tuesday. Find some time to check out that week's module so you know what the reading assignment is, so you know what's due, if anything is due on top of the discussion post. Just make sure you're on top of things. That's the most important part in many ways of an online class, is just staying on top of the work and staying on schedule. So the week begins on Monday morning when I publish everything, and then the week ends on the following Sunday night when everything for that week will be due. So you'll notice all of my deadlines are Sunday by midnight. So that's the end of the week. It makes sense, right? We run from Monday morning until late Sunday night. That is a week for us. So you have the entire week to get all of that week's work done. So make sure your discussion is in by midnight on Sunday. If there's an alternative media due that week, make sure it is also in by midnight on Sunday. So there's no confusion. I just like to keep things simple and consistent, particularly with online classes. So there shouldn't be any confusion about my deadlines. They're always Sunday at midnight. So as long as you're keeping up with things on a week-to-week basis, you should be in good shape. All right. So, like I said, if you have any questions about the class, the syllabus, Web Campus, or the book, email me. That's actually the very final thing I'll say before we jump into Chapter 1. Just a quick word about communication. I know most of you have taken online classes before, so you already know this, but with an online course, communicating with the instructor is very important. I'm obviously not going to see you guys in person unless you drive out to Winnemucca, because that's the campus where I work. Some of you might be local, and I do have office hours, so you're welcome to drop by on Monday afternoons. You can find my contact info and my office hours at the top of page 1 of the syllabus. So take a look at that. But the most important info there is my email. That's the way most of you are going to communicate with me. So if you have any questions, any problems, any concerns at any point in the semester, email me. Never hesitate to ask me a question or to just talk if you have concerns, if you feel like you're falling behind, if you struggled with one of the chapters or something that we're reading. Reach out. Let's talk. I check my email every day. You're never going to annoy me by emailing me. That might sound crazy, but even if you have a weird question, or even if you're asking something that I already talked about in lecture, and that probably will happen, I don't mind, because I would rather you ask me than just go along without knowing it and mess up in some way. That's what's more irritating, is when students don't email me and they don't ask me questions, and then they don't turn stuff in, or they don't do stuff the right way, and once they realize it, it's too late. I can't do a lot for you a week before the semester ends. I can't do a lot to help you with an assignment after that assignment is due. But if you get in touch with me ahead of time, I'm always available to help. We can exchange emails. We can also do video conferencing. Some students call me on the phone, although that's not very common anymore. We can do a video conference through Zoom or Cranium Cafe and Canvas. Just let me know, and we can figure something out. But you guys need to take the initiative. I have over 100 students this semester, not just this one class, but I have 5 classes, over 100 students. I can't check up on each one of you individually. So if you're struggling, you need to email me, and then I will get back to you within 24 hours. Give me a 24-hour window, and I will respond to your email, and we can figure it out, okay? But just make sure you remember that communication is key. All right, So that's enough as far as the intro is concerned. Let's turn over to chapter 1. So again, if you haven't read the chapter yet, not a big deal. I can give you most of what you need in this lecture, but typically my lectures are designed to go along with the reading. So I would like you to do most of the stuff kind of early or middle of the week. At least check out the module early in the week. You have the entire week to get everything done, but typically you should complete the reading and then watch my lecture after you've completed the reading. So watching the lecture might be one of the last things you do in a lot of weeks. After you've done your work, maybe after you've done the reading, you can watch the lecture. Or you might want to watch the lecture before you do the written work. But at the very least, read the chapter first, read whatever else I've assigned for that week, because sometimes we'll be reading some fiction, some primary sources, as I'll discuss soon, and we won't really be reading so much from the book on certain weeks. So just read whatever we're reading and then check out the lecture. They're supposed to kind of work hand in hand. The lecture is not meant to replace the reading. It's meant to come after the reading. But I know a lot of us might not have the book yet. I know it's the first week. Things are a little bit hectic. So I'll kind of go through chapter 1 here, and I'll also post it in PDF form if people need that. And then hopefully by week 2, we are fully up and running. So like I said, part of what we're doing in here is we're learning how to analyze literature, basically. Even though a lot of you have already done it in previous classes, or you've tried to, you've done something approaching analysis, but we probably haven't been as focused or as systematic as we need to be. Just like what you're doing in science class in 8th grade isn't quite as advanced or sophisticated as what you're doing in college science classes, right? It's the same here with our discipline, with my discipline, the discipline that you are visiting and perhaps pursuing long term. What we're doing here is a higher level. This is a 200 level class. We're no longer on that introductory 101 or 102 level. So that means, like I said, we're sharpening some existing skills, and then we're also going to build some new skills. But one of the things we want to do is move from a sort of emotional, gut level reaction to what we read, and we want to move more towards an analytical, reasoned approach to what we read. So there's nothing wrong with our initial emotional responses to what we read. And you all have these. I don't have to teach you how to have an emotional response to something that you read. Either you like it or you don't. Either it makes you happy or excited or interested, or it doesn't. Right? That's your initial gut level reaction. And you don't need any help with those. You come up with those all on your own. Those are natural. But typically that's where we stop when we're trying to talk about a work of literature or a movie or a show or a graphic novel. It often boils down to, I like that. I think that's good. Or I don't like that. That made me very angry and I don't think it's good. Those are fine places to start, but we are going to move beyond those gut level reactions that happen just kind of instinctually, right? Without much thought, without a whole lot of work being done. We're going to make the transition into a more analytical approach. So we still we start with the emotional, and then we move to a more analytical, a more nuanced, a more complex style of dealing with the text. And by analyzing it in more depth, we're going to end up with a greater understanding of that text. We're going to be able to do more with it. So that's one of our goals, one of our big goals. So let's talk a little bit about a few of the questions that they pose in chapter 1. And these are pretty important questions for us to consider and eventually maybe answer. Number 1, what is literature? Well, we need to know that. We need to establish that early on in a class that's all about literary study. So let's think about this. As the book points out on the opening pages, this is a term, literature, a word that is notoriously difficult to define. Now, sure, you can look it up in a dictionary, but Claire, our author, points out that a lot of the definitions that you find are going to be kind of vague and unsatisfying. They're not really going to tell you a whole lot because it becomes a little bit difficult to categorize. So a lot of people might say, okay, well, literature is just basically written expression. Okay, literature is written documents. But of course, we don't mean all written documents, right? We're sort of excluding some texts or some documents that don't seem very artistic, maybe, or they don't seem very literary in various ways. But again, it's kind of hard to explain what we mean by that. So Claire goes on to say other definitions might distinguish literature from other texts or other documents, written documents, by saying, oh, well, a work of literature is artistic. It has some kind of artistic value, or it has certain artistic properties or aesthetic properties that we can identify and discuss and analyze. So this is where we might find a distinction between, say, a poem or a novel on one side and the grocery list that I wrote last night, or a text message that I sent this morning, or an instruction manual that I used to build a bookcase. Those are all written documents, right? Those are all written expressions. But most people don't consider an instruction manual to be a work of literature. Most people don't think an instruction manual or a grocery list is the same as a poem or a novel or a short story. And yeah, we still use that basic distinction. But as the author kind of indicates, some people nowadays are starting to ask, does that distinction really matter? Do we have to separate novels and poems on one side from grocery lists and text messages and other quote-unquote non-literary texts on the other side? Maybe these different groups have more in common than we previously thought. So that's a question we can sort of chew on for the first few weeks of this semester. How exactly do we want to define literature? And what do we think about all of these other kinds of written expressions, these other kinds of written documents that have not traditionally been considered literature? So just for a little more background, Claire points out that the word literature comes from Latin, and it's derived from the Latin word for letter. Not a letter that you send to your grandma 30 years ago in the Dark Ages, but rather an individual letter, the smallest unit or element of alphabetical writing. So they get into kind of a complicated comparison between a text and a textile. So a textile is like a fabric, and obviously the words are very similar. So they say a text is very much like a textile or a piece of fabric. So you can think about a lot of textiles are like clothes, the clothes that we wear. So you might think about your shirt as functioning a lot like a text. So just like a fabric is made up of a lot of individual threads, and all of those threads, like I don't know how many threads are in a typical shirt, I guess thousands or millions, all of those threads work together to create the shirt, to create the whole piece of fabric. That's kind of like how a text works. You get a bunch of letters together, they equal a word. You get a bunch of words together, now you have sentences. You get a bunch of sentences together, now you have paragraphs. And if you combine a whole lot of paragraphs, you'll end up with a novel or a short story or some other type of complete text. So that's all kind of cool and interesting, but we don't typically think about fabrics or all of these definitions when we think about literature. So we're going to stick with some of our traditional definitions, but we're also going to focus on the things that most people focus on in literary study. So there are a certain group of priorities or main areas of interest that the scholars in the literary studies field are really focused on. So just like scientists working in biology have certain things that they are working on, they have certain concepts that are very important, certain priorities, we do too. And in the field of literary study, we are mostly focused on literature as a cultural or historical phenomenon. That's kind of the best way to appreciate literature. If you want to think about literature as a fabric, maybe you can do some interesting things with that, but typically we look at literature more for what it says about history and culture. A work of literature from a particular time and a particular place will tell us a lot about the history of that place, about the culture of that time, what people wore, what kinds of things people did, how people talked, the events that were going on during that time. So we often think of literature as being most valuable for what it tells us about history and about culture. We're also very interested in the production and the reception of works of literature. So what does that mean? Well, the production of literature, that means everything that went into the writing and the publishing of that text. So obviously the author writing it, but also the editor editing it and the publishing company publishing it. What went into all of that? Where was the drama? Were there various conflicts? Were changes made to the text at some point during the editorial stage? How did the author write it? What was going on in the author's life while she wrote it? Those are the kinds of questions we're interested in when we're looking at production. And then we also look at reception. That means, how was the text received? Did people like it? Did it sell a lot of copies? Were positive reviews written about it? Did scholars and critics think it was good? Those are the kinds of questions we can look at with reception. So these are the kinds of things we are going to be looking at when we start to analyze works of literature. But we can also look at this stuff when we're analyzing other kinds of texts, like advertisements, or web pages, or movies, or shows, or graphic novels. So again, one of the cool things about this class, at least I think it's cool, some people agree with me, is that we can take some of these skills that we're learning, some of the skills that go along with the field of literary study, and we can apply them to all kinds of other texts. Even if the stodgy old guys in literary study don't want to accept some of those other texts as literature, we can still analyze them. And we can do a lot of interesting things with them. And then maybe in future generations, they will be considered part of the literary family. We'll have to wait and see. But those are some of the things that we are going to be looking at throughout the semester. So we're going to use text, the word text, in a very broad way. So we can talk about literary texts, obviously. All the poems that we read are texts. All the short stories, all the plays, everything that we read that counts as literature, traditionally counts as literature, those are all texts. But text messages are texts. So are movies, so are shows, so are ads, so are different kinds of writing that might be characteristic of social media. Those are all texts too. So we can talk about a lot of different texts because we are going to be doing that throughout the semester. So just keep that in mind. Another thing they talk about in chapter 1 is this idea of creative expression. all literature really comes from this old source, this very fundamental need that humans seem to have. We have a need to express ourselves. And this has been true going back to prehistoric times, going back to cavemen. We have a need to express our imaginations, our dreams, our thoughts, ideas, certain fears that we might have. And this is not just true of modern people. So I actually included a link in the week 1 module, another thing that you may have already checked out. You don't have to worry too much about this, but if you have a few extra minutes, you might want to check it out. It's just a brief clip from a show on PBS about prehistoric cave paintings. Because in many ways, these are one of the first forms of narrative, one of the first forms of storytelling that we can find in the world. So this particular segment is about a cave that they discovered in France, I think back in the 90s. You don't need to know too much about it, but the host is taking us inside the cave. And at one point during the clip, if you're listening to the audio, you can hear the host asking the French tour guide as they're looking at this cave painting, which again we have no way of knowing quite how old it is. But this is prehistoric. This is before writing existed. This is before cities or like real civilization existed. This is prehistory. And already they were creating art. They were telling stories. They were expressing themselves. But the the host of the show asks the tour guide, hey, is this like a depiction of like a hunt? Is this what it would look like when these guys went out and hunted, like, I don't know, woolly mammoths or whatever prehistoric animals were around back then? And that's what most of us would probably assume, because most of the pictures in the cave were of animals, as you'll notice that. They're animals. So he's like, oh, this must be what it looked like when they went hunting. But listen to what the French tour guide says. He says, no, it's not a hunting scene. And the reason we know it's not is because there's no people. There's no people in the scene. And if it was a hunt, there would be hunters. There would be human hunters chasing the animals with spears and trying to kill them. But there aren't any people. It's just animals. So what the French tour guide says is, and a lot of people agree, a lot of scholars and historians agree, they think that most of these paintings were attempts by the cave people to depict their dreams, to depict what they dreamt about. And humans didn't seem to play a very big role in that, because most cave painting consists primarily of animals. And sometimes the animals are kind of doing human-like things. So that's a little bit spooky. But that's led a lot of historians to say these are dreams. Like, these are dream sequences. And these prehistoric people were trying to capture what their dreams looked like, which I think is just endlessly fascinating. You might not agree. But the point is, this impulse to create, this impulse to tell stories, has existed for a very long time. But one thing they point out in chapter 1 is that historically, in really old forms of art, in really old forms of literature, you have a strong visual component. And that's obviously true with cave paintings because they didn't have writing yet. So the only way they could express themselves was through visuals, through pictures, through images. But Clarer points out that even later forms of art, like poetry in ancient Greece, and even the poetry of Dark Ages England, like where, around the time of Beowulf, a lot of that poetry was oral. And in places like ancient Greece, where a lot of the poetry would have been spoken or sung aloud, there was often a musical accompaniment, and there would be performances, right? Sort of a visual performance. And that remains true with drama, of course. He points out that drama is the one traditional literary form that maintains that visual element. So drama just means plays, stage plays. Right? And of course, that's a tradition that's very old. The ancient Greeks had their own theater tradition. and it obviously existed all the way up through medieval and Renaissance Europe. So there was a strong visual component for a long time, but then with sort of the beginning of the modern age and really the invention of the printing press in the 1400s, the visual element kind of dropped off a little bit. Because before the printing press, all books had to be written by hand, which is kind of mind-blowing to think about. But as Clara points out, in the Middle Ages, before the printing press, like handwritten manuscripts would have a lot of cool illustrations. They would have a lot of cool sort of decorative design work to accompany the actual written text. So really early forms of literature weren't really text-based at all. They were purely visual. And then as we moved into sort of early civilizations, we start to have a combination of written text, or at least spoken text, along with some kind of visual element. And then a little bit later on, again, we have manuscripts, written text, along with visuals. But with the onset of the printing press, and we could mass produce texts at that point, we kind of dropped a lot of the illustrations, a lot of the decorations. But of course, you guys know, a lot of books still have illustrations. That's never stopped entirely. And as he points out in chapter 1, a lot of more modern art forms, like graphic novels, combine written text, written words, with pictures and visuals. And, a lot of stuff on the internet also does that. Think about a typical web page. If it's well designed and it looks good, it's going to be a combination of written text and some kind of visual element. They even mention movies. This might seem like a weird one because you're thinking, well, there's not really written text in a movie. No, not typically, but movies do record speech. They record the spoken words of the actors. So even though you're not usually reading text unless you're watching a foreign movie and reading subtitles, you might not be reading the text, but you're hearing it. And the movie, by getting all of that stuff on film, the movie is creating a record of that spoken language, just like a book kind of does. Like, I can go back to a book anytime and read the text on a page by actually looking at it. But I can also go back to a movie anytime and I can hear that language, that spoken language. There's a record of it. So in some ways, movies function like written texts. So that's why a lot of people say we should consider movies to be another type of literature, or at least it's an art form that is adjacent to literature. And we can use a lot of the same techniques that we use to analyze literature to also analyze movies, or graphic novels, or web pages, or whatever you like. But before we start getting crazy and kind of making our own rules, we need to be clear on the traditional definitions of literature. Again, we're not always bound by these anymore in the modern age. But it's a general principle in school. Before you can start doing your own thing and putting your own twist on an academic field, or a field of study, you have to understand that field of study. You have to understand the traditional terms, the traditional definitions and techniques. And then once you've mastered them, or at least gotten comfortable with them, you can start to put your own spin on things. So traditionally, going way back, there were really only 3 genres or categories of literature. A genre is just a category or a type. So I'll be using that word a lot. The 3 basic genres were poetry, and we're all familiar with poetry, but these would typically be what's called lyrical or lyric poems. Relatively short, and probably originally, at least back in ancient Greece and some other ancient societies, like Clara points out, poetry probably had its origins in sort of musical performances. They were sung, there was a visual component, but now, of course, we still see poems in different formats. So we had poetry, we had drama or plays, they've been around for a long time, and then we had epics. So think about the Odyssey or the Iliad or Beowulf. Those are epics. Now, what gets a little bit confusing about epics is that technically they are poems. So like other works of poetry, epics are usually written in verse. That just means that they're following certain rules pertaining to rhyme scheme or metrical pattern or line length or stanza length. Verse just has a lot of rules and it has to be in a certain structure. Whereas prose, the opposite of verse, prose is what we find in novels or short stories. Prose sounds more like the way people actually talk, and there aren't as many rules to follow. So typically we would separate epics back in the old days, even though they are in verse. We would separate epics from other forms of poetry because epics actually kind of have more in common with novels. Epics have plots. They cover long periods of time. They have characters. They have settings. They have all of these elements that we would expect to find in novels or short stories. So typically nowadays we've replaced epics with what we call prose fiction, just to distinguish it from poetry, from verse. So prose fiction means novels and short stories. And yeah, epics still exist, but people don't really write them very much anymore. So the epic category or genre has kind of been replaced by prose fiction, novels or short stories. So we pretty much still have three general categories. We still have poetry, we still have drama, and now we've replaced epics with the more general heading of prose fiction, and that can include epics along with novels and short stories. But again, that's a little confusing because technically epics aren't in prose, but they have a lot more in common with other prose fiction than they do with shorter lyrical poetry. So those are the traditional genres, and we're going to be learning about those throughout the next several weeks. So we're going to be learning about the key elements and conventions of each one of those genres, starting with novels, short stories, and a little bit of epics. That's going to be our first category, prose fiction. Then we do poetry, and then later we do drama. So as we move through each of those traditional genres, we're going to learn their conventions, we're going to learn how they work, and then we're going to read examples of each genre. And those examples, as I mentioned earlier, are not found in the book. They will be provided by me in the form of links or PDFs. Okay, so don't worry, they'll be free and they'll be available in Web Campus. So beginning next week, we're going to start reading Chapter 2. That's all about novels, short stories, and a little bit of epics. And then the following week, in week 3, we're going to read some examples of that literary genre, selected by me, and hopefully you'll find some stuff that you like. All right, so very quickly, I just want to wrap up this lecture by going through a few other important terms that Clarer mentions in Chapter 1. He mentions text type and discourse. These are two words that might come up for us over the course of the semester. Both of these terms really come from linguistics, and that is a separate field. That is a different academic field than the study of literature. We have some things in common, but we are not the same. Linguistics is really the scientific study of language, really studying the mechanics of language. It has more in common with social science or even the hard sciences rather than literary study. But like us, they are interested in texts. So they came up with these terms, text type, to refer to basically any non-literary text. So like I was talking about earlier, newspaper articles, text messages, instruction manuals, advertisements. Those could all be considered text types. They're not literature, right? They don't fit in to those traditional definitions of literature, those traditional genres, but maybe we can analyze them in similar ways. And maybe we could even include things like my grocery list or street signs. I mean, those are texts too, right? Even a street sign could be considered a text, and maybe we could analyze it. So keep that term in mind, and also remember discourse. This is an even broader term. Discourse basically means any classifiable expression of language. So this could be spoken language or written language. So we could be talking about almost anything spoken or written, just so long as it has a purpose and it has some kind of structure or meaning that we can actually analyze and look at. So discourse can be kind of slippery because it's not always written down. Sometimes discourse is just spoken. It's like a rumor that's going around, and we hear it, and we can do something with it. It has some kind of importance, or it has some kind of meaning that we can get to the bottom of. So we'll talk about those terms a little bit more throughout the semester. And then finally, know the difference between a primary source and a secondary source. This is very important, and we'll talk more about it later. But for now, just get the basic definitions down. A primary source is an artistic object. Typically, it will be the object of analysis in literary study. So these are the things that we write about when we write about literature. So primary sources will typically be novels or poems. They can come from any of the traditional literary genres. A play, an epic, a short story, whatever. Those are primary sources. We read them, and then we analyze them and write about them. So when we are writing about primary sources, we are creating secondary sources of our own. A secondary source is a scholarly or critical treatment of a primary source. So typically, secondary sources will be articles or essays or book reviews. These are things written by scholars, critics, teachers, and students. They are analysis of the primary document. So eventually, we are going to be creating secondary sources of our own. And they will often appear in places like newspapers, magazines, academic journals. I mean, the papers that you write in this class might not end up in those places. Maybe. You never know. But the stuff that the professionals produce, the articles and essays written by professionals in the field, will often show up in popular publications, sometimes, at least like book reviews will. And then the lengthy essays or articles will often appear in academic journals. And most regular humans don't read those, but people within the field read those. So I read academic journals in the field of English, in the field of literature, to be more exact. And advanced students might also read those journals. Professors, scholars, experts are going to be familiar with those journals. But something like a book review might show up in a popular magazine, and almost anybody is likely to read that. So know the basic distinction between these types of documents, these types of texts. So look at it this way. We're going to be reading primary sources throughout the semester, and then when we write about them, we are creating secondary sources. And as we'll see, secondary sources within the field of literary study, they have certain rules, certain conventions that must be followed, certain procedures that must be followed, and we're going to learn a lot of those later in the semester. Towards the end of the semester, as we're working on our final papers. We're also going to be learning about literary criticism and literary theory. Those are tools within the field that we can use when we're analyzing primary sources. So in the second half of the semester, we're going to be learning about different types of critical approaches. We're also going to be learning about the rules and the standards for creating secondary sources as we prepare our literary research paper, which is our big final assignment. So of course, we'll have plenty of time to talk more about that. But the main rule, the main standard that we have to worry about when we are creating secondary sources will, of course, be citation rules, documentation. We have to cite everything, and we have to follow certain MLA rules that you're probably already familiar with, at least to some extent, but we'll talk more about those later. So that's pretty much it for week one. Hopefully you have a pretty good idea of what we're doing in this class. Hopefully you feel pretty good about chapter 1 and our first couple of assignments. Our first discussion post is very easy. It's just an introduction. Typically with those discussion posts, I'll ask you specific questions about the assigned reading for that week. That's usually what I use the discussion for, to make sure that we are reading, that we're keeping up with the reading, and that we're thinking about the reading. But here in week one, because I know a lot of us don't have the books yet, and we might be scrambling a bit, I'll take it easy on you. The first week's discussion is a light, easy thing. Just introduce yourself. Tell us a few basic things about yourself. I have a little prompt that you can respond to. But then starting next week with week 2, the discussions will get a little bit more focused, and I'll want you to answer specific questions. But I also encourage you guys to talk to one another on the discussion board. You can comment on each other's posts, and that begins this week. You can talk to each other, ask each other questions. I know this is an online class, but we can still create a sense of community, and I would like to do that. So let me know if you have any questions. I look forward to working with you, and I will see you next week.